Now, when I was a kid, there was a great man with a message a lot like that. He impacted millions of loyal followers, including me, and many of you were deeply touched by his message. Let's watch this.
Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Would you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor? Welcome to this neighborhood, neighbor.
It's so warm and fuzzy. And it's kind of interesting because a lot of people, when they think of Jesus, end up sort of envisioning this like first century version of Mr. Rogers. A really nice guy who walked around saying really nice things, and we all ought to be neighbors together, and we ought to be nice to each other, and won't you be my neighbor? And a lot of people, when they think about Jesus, kind of think of him like he's sort of a dreamer. Like not really in touch with the high-pressure grown-up world that I happen to live in, but man, what a nice guy. And we all ought to be, more like him, but of course we can't because we live in the real world. Now here's the problem with that idea. Did you ever see anybody get really mad at Mr. Rogers? I mean, you ever hear anybody say man, that Mr. Rogers really ticks me off. I wish somebody would come up with a plan to assassinate that guy. Not so much. Everybody loved Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers was not really a dangerous guy. But Jesus, it turns out, was a dangerous guy. And he did not bring peace everywhere he went. Jesus caused controversy everywhere he went. Jesus caused riots. Jesus ticked people off. People wanted to kill Jesus. Jesus lived in an explosive time, and he said explosive things. And most of it is tied to what he taught over and over about the kingdom of God. Jesus was constantly talking about the kingdom. He would go around everywhere and say, let me tell you about the kingdom. And if we're going to understand why Jesus was so dangerous, what made him so incredibly explosive, a key question is, what did people in Jesus' day hear when he said the phrase, kingdom of God? Because he didn't just make that up. That is not original to Jesus. That idea had been around for a long, long time before Jesus, and it was a very dangerous idea. It was the idea that got him killed. Now, in our day, a lot of people, when they hear the phrase kingdom of God, they sort of envision a place that you go after you what? After you die. But in the first century, when people heard that phrase, the kingdom of God, they did not envision a place you go after you die. To the people of Israel, the kingdom of God would arrive on earth when Israel's God would finally come with power and establish Israel as a sovereign nation once again. That would be the kingdom. A descendant of David would once again sit on the throne in Jerusalem. The temple of the Jews would be restored. Israel's enemies would be defeated. And it would be restored to the prominence of the old days, the glory days. Other nations would then turn their gaze and look at Israel with envy and awe and say, wow, what a blessed people. And that left a lot of people in Israel wondering, where is the kingdom of God? Because they were living in another kingdom. They were living in the kingdom of Rome. More specifically, it was the kingdom of Caesar. And the Romans said that Caesar was divine, that he was a god. There were slogans floating around in Jesus' day like this: there is no other name under heaven by which men can be saved than Caesar. They'd say, Caesar is Lord. Does any of that sound familiar? In fact, a Roman coin had an image of Caesar on it, and there was an inscription underneath that read, Divi Filius, which translated means Son of God. Interesting. Caesar was the Son of God. This was incredibly offensive to Jewish people, to the Israelites, because they worshiped one God, the God of heaven. In fact, devout rabbis of that generation would not even touch the coins. The Israelites, like reeling in this pagan culture, were constantly asking, where is the kingdom of God? And the Romans actually took over their temple in Jerusalem. They let them use it, but the Romans ran it. Herod, the Roman ruler, would come in and name the high priest. The Israelites had always had a plan and a way that they would establish their own high priest. But Herod, the Roman ruler of the area, would name the high priest from among a group of Israelites who would collaborate with Rome. Whoever is good to Rome will get power. And Herod would keep the sacred objects from the temple in his fortress. And on the Day of Atonement, in order to fulfill the rituals and sacrifices, in order to be able to worship their God in their sacred way, they actually had to go ask the local Roman ruler for their sacred objects so they could use them and worship. It was humiliating for them. It was just more Roman oppression. And on top of this, Caesar and Rome unjustly taxed the snot out of them. I mean, they were so brutally taxed by the Roman Empire that people lost their land and they lost their home, and people were literally starving to death. So the Israelites were crying out to God again and again and again, where's the kingdom? Where's the kingdom? Where's the kingdom? This was the question in Jesus' day. When is the kingdom coming, and how's it going to get here? And anyone providing spiritual direction in Israel had to address this question. And in Jesus' day, there were three main responses to this question. Different religious groups of Jews that had different responses to this question. And when we understand a little bit about these groups, it helps us understand why what Jesus said and did was so explosive. The people in the first group were called zealots, right? Zealots. They believed that the kingdom would come to Israel when there were enough people, enough Israelites willing to take up arms and revolt, and so they chose the way of attack. This was an extreme nationalist party. Essentially, as far as the Romans were concerned, they were terrorists. And they were devoted to bringing the kingdom by overthrowing the Romans. And they would use any means necessary, including violence. Okay, some of them were assassins. Question: how do you think Rome felt about the zealots? Another question: do you think Jesus knew any zealots? Check this out. This is Luke chapter 6. It says, when morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them. He also designated them apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, and then check this out. Simon, who was called the Zealot. How about that? One of Jesus' disciples was a radical political extremist who had dedicated his life to overthrowing the system, the establishment, the Roman Empire, by any means possible. So you think about this for a second. How do you think the Roman authorities felt when they found out that one of Jesus' inner circle guys was a zealot? Why do you think he'd do that? Let's hold on to that. There's a second religious group of Jews that we need to know about if we want to understand the political climate of Jesus' day, and they were called Essenes. Now, this group is not specifically mentioned in the New Testament. We know a lot more about this religious sect, and we've come to know a lot more about them in the last 60 or so years. They're famous because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Have you all heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Okay. They were found near what body of water? The Dead Sea. Okay, good. You guys are with me. Okay, so the Dead Sea Scrolls were the writings that were part of this Essene community, which included many Old Testament documents from the time of Jesus, which is really cool. They were incredibly well preserved. And so there are copies of the Old Testament text that go way back like to the time of Jesus. And they were hidden away in caves where the Essenes lived. And they were discovered between 1947 and 1956. Now, during Jesus' day, the Essenes, the reason that they kept these texts and they were so well preserved is because they separated themselves from everybody else. They were separatists. They lived in the caves called the Qumran by the Dead Sea, and their response to this whole Roman issue was to withdraw completely, to hide away from all of the corruption and just go live in caves. And they believed that the kingdom of God would come when a group of people had separated themselves from all the corruption and all the sin and become so pure. And the idea was to withdraw from the influence of the Roman culture, not only from Romans, but from any other Israelites that were influenced by this evil Roman culture. And they figured that once they were pure enough, once they were holy enough, God would respond to them favorably and bring his kingdom back to earth, and so they would withdraw completely from everything. And they were so devoted, to the rules and the law and purity, they actually refused to relieve themselves on the Sabbath. They were afraid that it might defile the Sabbath. Think about that. They would hold it all day. And they were crazy pure. They were so committed to it. They would take a ritual bath before every meal. And you think about a community of people living up in the caves, trying to get enough fresh water up there to bathe 3 times a day for everybody. They called themselves the sons of light. And they believed that when they were pure enough, God would then come and God would blowtorch the sons of darkness, which was, of course, everybody else. And the Essenes were incredibly extreme in their way of life. Okay, but there are other religious groups that sort of took the same approach that are more familiar to many of us. The Pharisees also withdrew, right? They withdrew from anything unholy. They were notorious from isolating themselves from common people, kept their distance from anything unclean. They just sort of lived in this big holy huddle. And then a third group with an extreme approach, kind of a different approach to all of this, was the Sadducees. The Sadducees looked at the Romans and they thought, well, they're here to stay. And if you can't beat them, join them. So their response to this crisis of the kingdom was to just compromise. They decided to just collaborate with Rome, to get real friendly with Rome. And so they worked with Rome to collect these taxes that were starving their people. They paid allegiance to Caesar. They interacted and deferred to the Roman political powers, whoever they happened to be at whatever time they happened to be in power. And they were granted by the Romans all the positions of importance in Israel. Imagine that. The high priest and the chief priests were all Sadducees. They ran the temple, and the temple was big business in Jerusalem. Okay, by law, everybody had to travel there and offer sacrifices 3 times a year. And so those pilgrims would have to pay for lodging, and they'd have to pay for food, and they'd have to exchange their foreign money. And if you tweaked the exchange rate just a little bit, you could make a killing. And they'd have to buy animals to sacrifice. You didn't want to bring your animal all that way with you. And so if you monopolized the access to these sacrificial animals and you jacked up the price just a little bit, huge money. And the Sadducees controlled all of this. They ran the temple. They were the ones who collaborated and compromised with Rome. They were not real popular with the zealots. And they figured out how to turn all of this into big business. Now, if you're an Israelite, these are the 3 main groups in Jesus' day. And if you are waiting for the kingdom of God, you basically have 3 responses. You can get mad and hate and become hostile and go the way of attack. Or you can withdraw into your own little commune and try to become as pure as possible and just to kind of say, you know what, the rest of the world can go to hell. Or you can say, I don't think things are ever going to be any different, so I might as well try to get mine while I'm here. I'll just compromise as much as I need to get what it is that I want. And for us to understand how dangerous Jesus was, we need to understand how much trouble his approach to the kingdom got him into. Not just with Rome, but with everybody else. With the attackers, with the withdrawers, and the compromisers. So I want to quickly kind of run through a few different passages that are probably familiar to many of you and just see what Jesus was up to. See some of the stuff that he did that really fired people up. In Matthew chapter 8, we're told that a centurion comes to Jesus to ask for help. Now, a centurion was a Roman what? Soldier. Yeah, a Roman soldier, okay? And now if you're a Jew, that just represents evil. Everything that's wrong with your situation. So a Roman soldier is asking Jesus, a Jewish rabbi, for help. Here's the story. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help, which is pretty bold. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly. Jesus said to him, shall I come heal him? The centurion replied, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. In other words, you don't have to go, just say the word, Jesus. You have all the authority. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, truly I tell you, he's speaking to Jews, he's speaking to those that are Israelites. Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Wow. Really, Jesus? Says to the crowd, look at this Roman soldier. I have not found anyone with this kind of faith anywhere in Israel. Now, this is not a wise political move. Okay, you think about how this would sound to the zealots that are standing in the crowd that day. Another time in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Really, Jesus? Then he says this, he illustrates. He says, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Did you have that happen to you this last week? Someone forced you to go 1 mile? What is that all about? Well, Roman soldiers were actually empowered by Roman law to take citizens living in any country that they had occupied, like Israel, and force them to carry a Roman soldier's gear for up to 1 mile. Soldier could just be walking along and say, hey, you're going to carry my stuff. You'd have to drop whatever you were doing in that moment, in that day, and do it. To not do it was against the law, and it was punishable by death. Now, for understandable reasons, Jewish people hated that. So Jesus is saying, here's the kind of thing I'm talking about when it comes to loving your enemies. If a Roman soldier makes you carry his gear for 1 mile, not only do you do what is required, but at the end of the mile, out of sheer love and grace, you might say something like this. You know what, sir? I bet being a soldier in a foreign country far away from your family is really hard. Could I help you more? Could I carry your gear for you another mile? Again, think about how that sounded to the Jewish people. Think about how that sounded to the zealots. And think about how much courage it took for Jesus to say it. We think of that stuff, that very thing right there, as the kind of stuff that Mr. Rogers would say. But the zealots didn't hear those words and say to themselves, oh my goodness, that's so sweet. Let's put a plaque on the wall with those words on it someplace. Jesus is quite deliberately saying, the kingdom of Rome has some real darkness. But the zealots are wrong. Guys, the zealots are wrong. The kingdom of God is not about blasting the pagans. There's a better way. But the zealots are not the only group that Jesus offends, not by a long shot. He's consistently offending all of the purity through withdrawal people. And we see this. I mean, you think about this familiar story. It says, a man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and what? Touched the man. I am willing, he said. Be clean. Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. So Jesus reaches out and touches the body of a man ravaged by leprosy. Did Jews have any laws about touching people with leprosy? So, question, why doesn't Jesus just heal him without touching him? Right? Certainly Jesus could say, just kind of, be healed. And the guy would be transformed right there before everybody, and then Jesus would say, come to Papa. Right? I mean, why reach out and touch him first? But Jesus touches people with leprosy. Jesus talks with prostitutes. He eats meals with tax collectors at tax collector parties. And who's this behavior going to offend? It's going to offend all the withdrawal. It's going to offend the Essenes, and it's going to offend the Pharisees. Powerful, powerful people. And Jesus is very intentionally saying that the strategy of seclusion is not the way. The kingdom of God is not going to come to earth by all the holy people withdrawing, by isolating from the irreligious into these little safe little religious subcultures. That's not how the kingdom is going to come. One more example. Matthew 22, we find another sweet story. Some Pharisees team up with the Romans, which we hear that, we're like, oh yeah. That is like the Democrats teaming up with the Republicans. That's like, you just don't do that. Pharisees team up with some Romans, and they team up to question Jesus and trap him in his words. Now, again, as far as I know, nobody ever tried to trap Mr. Rogers in his words. Nobody ever connived together and asked, okay, now, Mr. Rogers, what do you really mean by neighbor? But the Pharisees, they come after Jesus to trap him, to get him into trouble. The kind of trouble they're hoping that would lead to his execution. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples, okay, like mini Pharisees, to him along with the Herodians. Who are the Herodians? Well, the Herodians are Herod's cronies, okay? They're like Roman officials, so to speak. So you get the scene in your mind. These Pharisees, these Jewish leaders, are teaming up with Romans to trap Jesus. Jesus is with the crowd, and the Pharisees and Herodians walk up, and it says, "Teacher," they said, "we know that you are a man of integrity, and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then," and here comes the dagger. "Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?" Oh man, what an explosive question. The Roman taxes were crushing people, causing them to lose their homes, starving people to death. The Roman taxes were a major source of misery for the Israelites. When Jesus was a boy, just a little historical story, there was a man named Judas of Galilee, okay, from Jesus' home area. And he led a revolt, a tax revolt, along with 2,000 Israelites. And they just declared to Rome, "No more, we will not pay taxes." Judas and all 2,000 of his followers were crucified by the Romans. And they left the crosses standing on the main road in and out of Galilee for everybody to see, to send a message to anybody who was thinking about it. Not paying taxes to Rome can be hazardous for your health. And as a boy, Jesus traveled that road all the time, and he saw those crosses, and he saw the reminder again and again and again. And now here he is. "Rabbi, tell us, should we pay taxes to Caesar?" And you have to imagine the tension of this moment, because if Jesus says, yes, you should pay the taxes, then the great masses of Israelites will hate him. But if Jesus says, no, don't pay your taxes, Rome still got a lot of crosses. So Jesus says, "You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me?" He says, show me the coin used for paying the tax. Quick question. Why does Jesus have to ask someone to give him a coin? Because he doesn't have one. Because no devout rabbi would carry that coin around. So while someone else holds up the coin, Jesus points to it and asks, whose image is this and whose inscription? And of course, it's Caesar's portrait with the inscription, Son of God. And so it just kills these Jewish people to say it, but they choke out Caesar's. So Jesus says, all right then. Then he said to them, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. And Jesus is saying, go ahead and give Caesar what's his. This is not about a tax revolt. I'm not here to start a tax revolt. I'm not here to start a political uprising. Again, do you think that was popular with the zealots? But he goes on and he says, but you make sure to give God what's God's. He's saying anybody who allows money and power to dominate their life, anybody who will bow down to one of these little coins is in serious trouble in the kingdom of God. Who is Jesus blasting here with this statement? The Sadducees. All the guys who had collaborated, who had traded their own values to pursue the coins. And they are standing in the crowd looking at him. Jesus is blasting them. This is not Mr. Rogers. Jesus is blasting everybody here, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. He's like, yep, Caesar is the emperor, and this is his money. And if he says you have to pay taxes, I'm just telling you, you have to pay taxes. But he is not a God. You give to God what's God's. The Romans are wrong. Caesar is not Lord. There's another kingdom, and it's real, and it is breaking into this earth through me. But all these other groups that are clamoring around, they're all wrong too. Everybody's wrong. Okay? Attack, anger, violence, that is not the way. Withdrawal, that's not the way. Compromise, that is not the way. So here's the good news. You just keep your eyes on me, Jesus would say. You just keep your eyes on me because I am the way. God's kingdom is now coming, and it's coming to earth through me, through my life, through my teaching, through my death on the cross for the forgiveness of sins, through my defeat of death, through the resurrection. And the kingdom will now come in and through this new community that I'm starting. So who's with me? And he starts piecing this community together. And you think about, who does he take? Who does he take in his little community? He takes the strangest people. Kind of odd, actually. Simon, you're a zealot. You hate Romans, and you hate the collaborators like tax collectors. You come into my new little community. And then he chooses Matthew. Anybody remember what Matthew's job was? He's a tax collector. Okay, Matthew, you're a sellout collaborator, a compromiser, a despised tax collector. You join my little community. You can room with Simon. You guys are going to have some real interesting talks late at night. I mean, can you imagine Matthew and Simon sitting next to each other, sitting around a fire, roasting marshmallows, right? Singing worship songs together. I mean, no one's really ever heard of a community like this. Hey, Nicodemus, you're a Pharisee. You're about withdrawing from the common people, isolating from sinners. You're into purity. I'm going to take you. How about you come into my little community? Hey, Samaritan woman at the well. Wrong gender, wrong race, wrong religion, wrong sexual history, as sexually broken as they come. I'm going to take you. You come into my little community. You can sit next to Nicodemus at dinner. It's going to be awesome. There had never been a community like this one in the history of the world. And Jesus gathers together this little community, and it becomes a very dangerous movement. And Jesus says to them, here's our strategy. You guys want a strategy? Here's our strategy. Guys, I know you're confused, but here's our strategy. We've got no money. We got no connections. We've got no status. We got no soldiers. This is perfect. Things are going exactly to plan. We're going to tell them all that they're all on the wrong track. And the Roman money and the power guys and the attackers and the withdrawers, we're going to tell them that they're all wrong. And when they hate us, and a lot of them will, and when they call us names, and when they throw us in prison, and when they kill some of us, we won't back down, and we won't give in, and we won't get bitter. We're just going to keep loving them all. And when they hit us on one side of the face, we're just going to turn the other cheek. And when they make us walk 1 mile with them, we're going to go 2. We'll just keep loving them and loving them and loving them, and we'll keep inviting them. You come join our little community too. You come join our little community too. And so he says to this odd assortment of people, this collection of absolute misfits, you just stay real close to me because my love is going to spill over into you, and your love will spill over into them, and it is going to be real dangerous. We're going to change the world. We're going to turn the kingdom of Rome upside down. The kingdom of God is going to break through. But you just watch me. You watch what I do, and then you watch what God does. Now that's a dangerous idea. It's an explosive idea. And it's an idea that exploded into a movement that would not be stopped. Like despite great persecutions, people being thrown to the lions, people being tortured and burned on poles, and yet it would not be stopped, which is exactly what Jesus predicted. Guys, the kingdom is here in me, and it will carry on through you. And Jesus said, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. There's pain and there's suffering and there's loneliness everywhere. Jesus said that for now the world belongs to the prince of darkness. And he had his way for a long, long time. But now in Jesus, the new kingdom is coming. It's invading earth. But we need to get clear about how the kingdom comes. Jesus says it's not going to happen the zealot way. The world does not need another church that stands on the sidelines and talks about all the dark, wicked people that are out there and just lets it go to hell. It's not going to happen by the way of withdrawal. The world does not need another church where everybody just withdraws in their own little cloister of holy huddles, church activities and programs without any relationships outside. It's not going to come by Christians getting co-opted by the world and saying, there's a lot of money and comfort and success here. I'm going to use God to make sure that I get my share. That's what my faith is going to be about. No, the kingdom comes one way, comes through uncompromising love. And it happens when we get close enough to Jesus to start to see what Jesus sees, to feel what he feels, to see people the way he sees them, to see all the brokenness and pain around us and say, I have to do something about that. It happens when the people of God look around at the world and say, I have to do something about that. My life isn't just about me and finding avenues toward my own comfort and my own success. It has to be about loving people, serving people, impacting people. And I'm willing to make huge sacrifices, actually, for that to happen. Because when I think about it hard enough, I realize that's the only thing that really matters. Now, it's interesting because within 300 years, if you know history very well, Christianity did overcome Rome. It overcame Rome. As a persecuted minority, Jesus' followers lived and they loved recklessly. And from bottom up, Christianity pervaded the kingdom of Rome. And eventually, then, Christianity took on a new form. And we've talked about this a lot over the last few years. But it made its way from bottom to top. And eventually, the Roman emperor, anybody remember his name? Constantine, embraced it. And he made it the official religion of the Roman Empire. And suddenly, it was infused with power and wealth. And as we know, ugly, terrible things happened in Jesus' name. Especially when Christianity went on the attack. And for 2,000 years, whenever people misunderstand the kingdom, when people misunderstand Jesus, okay, his invitation, his mission, and they turn it into something else, anything else, terrible things happen. And yet even so, There are always pockets of people that get it. Even in some of the worst of times, there were people that got it, and God still uses those people to bring his kingdom to earth. When people learn to love like Jesus, to pray as Jesus prayed, Father, your kingdom come, your will be done, where? On earth as it is in heaven. When God's people pray that and they live that, see, everybody wins. Because they bring heaven with them everywhere they go. It's like a boat moving through still waters. They just leave a wake of the kingdom everywhere they go. Their families look more like heaven, right? Their workplaces, particular departments of their workplaces look more like heaven. Their neighborhoods, their schools, they look more like heaven. And this is the invitation from Jesus to you and me. Come to me, give yourself to me, and I will use you to change some part of the world. Your heart will be filled with peace and joy and strength and love, and I will use you wherever you go to bring heaven to this world. And I've looked at this. This is so attractive to me. This is what I want for my life. I want my family to look more like heaven because I'm a part of it. I want to coach a 6th grade girls basketball team that looks more like heaven because I was a part of it. I want to leave this wake of heaven everywhere I go. But to do that, the same guidelines still apply. Like attack, withdrawal, and compromise are not the way. The kingdom is not going to come through me if I go on the attack. It won't come if I start to isolate from ungodliness and brokenness. It won't come if I start to compromise all of my values. So I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I'll tell you that while I am more than capable of all three of those things, I think like many of you, I am a whole lot more prone to compromise than the other two. If I had you guys stand up and I just had you name your sin, right? And I was like, okay, stand up if you're an attacker. Stand up if you like to withdraw. Stand up if you're a compromiser. I bet this room would be filled with compromisers because that's our culture. That's our church culture. But for me, attacking and isolating are not my biggest issues, but man, compromising. That's a different deal because I don't know about you, I like to fit in. I like to be liked. I don't like conflict. I don't like to stand up to stuff. Mostly, I kind of like to blend in. But if I let that desire rule me, if I compromise in places where I shouldn't, then I don't become someone who brings heaven. I'm not somebody who heaven comes through. I just become a contributor to the problem. And so I want to just close this by describing a season of where this was just really a big tension for me. In between finishing like my pastoral training years ago and moving down here from Bellingham to start Brookview, I went through this really weird transition time. Jen and I had a baby and a toddler at home, and we knew that we weren't in a spot to be able to move and pull the trigger on starting this church. And so we knew that moving down here from Bellingham was going to happen sometime soon. But in the meantime, I needed to provide for the family. And this is shocking, but nobody was offering a living wage for a temporary pastor in any church. So I got a job in an oil refinery doing construction, structural steel construction. And I spent 1.5 years of my life doing that. It was the weirdest season of my entire life. I was, some of you, I don't know if this is hard for you to imagine. I was a fish out of water. The whole construction thing for me, it just wasn't really me. I don't like coveralls. It's hard to talk to other people when you're wearing ear protection. And I like people. I like talking to people. I like teaching. I like discussing and exploring ideas. I like listening to people tell me about their lives, right? You can't do that when you're wearing ear protection very well. And so construction just wasn't relational enough for me. But But God handed me this job on a platter. It just sort of fell in my lap, and it was a good paying job. And I felt like I was there for a reason. I felt like I was there to impact people. I wasn't supernatural at doing construction, but I did my best. And I learned and I got better. And I'm going to tell you, I actually built some cool stuff. But I felt like God had me there to do something more than just build cool stuff. And I didn't have to be in the refinery very long to realize that it didn't feel a lot like heaven. And many of you spend hours every day in workplaces that have issues. The refinery was a brutal place. People treated each other horribly, like really, really mean stuff. And most people went home beaten down every single day. Now, I just spent 3 years hanging out with guys that wanted to go into ministry and be pastors. And they were polite, and they were highly educated, and they were generally super nice. Overnight, I went from that to a different world. People were not polite. The F-bombs were flowing like a river. Most of the jokes were either really crude or really mean. And the last thing that I wanted to do was come across like church boy. And just so you know, I had a past, right? I grew up throwing F-bombs around right and left myself. At one time, I was the king of dirty jokes. So, like, this was not totally foreign territory to me, actually. But it had been a while. And I hadn't really lived that way for a little while. And so I just wanted to fit in and be one of the dudes. But I also wanted to honor God. And so there was this constant tension. Like, you know, and I talked about this a few weeks ago. People would tell an off-color joke. And guess who everybody standing around looked at? Right? The pastor guy. And so I'm sitting there and I'm just like, what do I do with that? You know? Do I laugh? Because honestly, it was funny. I mean, some of that stuff, I'm like, that's hilarious, actually. But do I like look disgusted, you know? Or do I pretend like, I don't get it? And so I'm just wrestling with this all the time. But the joking and all of that, the crassness wasn't really the big struggle. For me, it was just the constant negativity. Just people ripping on each other all the time. It was bad. Certain guys would just get torn apart. They would just get eaten up. And maybe you've been in places like this where it's just like sharks that smell blood in the water. These guys are weak and they get devoured. And I really felt like God had intentionally put me in this place. He wanted me to bring goodness to it any way that I could. So I would get to work every day about 20 minutes early, and I'd sit in the parking lot and just pray. I would pray that God would enable me to connect, and that I wouldn't be seen as like a religious freak. And I'd pray that God would give me wisdom to react to stuff the way Jesus would, especially to irreligious people, the way Jesus would. I wanted that. I wanted to be able to be true to my values and still connect with people. I wanted to bring a life of goodness to what was a really dark place. I wanted people there to fall in love with Jesus because there was so much emptiness and so much anger and hurt in that place. So I'd get to work early, about 20 minutes early, and just pray for all that stuff. And especially I would pray for the 6 or 7 people that I knew I would be working with every day, that God would help me to connect. And over that year, God did some really cool stuff. I felt like I was able to make a pretty significant connection with everybody on my crew. Made some great friends. And we actually shared our lives together. We hung out outside of work quite a bit. And I had some great conversations with people about God. In fact, I even started this little Bible study with one guy, and we had to be at work by about 6:15. So he's like, come over to my house at 5 a.m. and let's read the Bible together. He's like, you're like an expert. Let's do this. His job was to make sure there was coffee. My job was to be able to read. And so we would read through the Bible and talk about it. And in those times, God did amazing stuff. And I'm not sure who got more out of it, him or me. It was kind of interesting because he was a brilliant guy. Like when there was banter going on back and forth between everybody, he was so sharp, just witty, talented. But he had serious trouble with reading. And so to read the Bible with him and to ask him to read it, and he did, let him talk about it. Let him see that stuff and understand it and just start to see him get it, and the light bulb would come on and he would come alive. It was just like the highlight of my week. So after a few months, he started walking around the refinery going, hey, you got to come to my Bible study. These people were like, really? He's like, yeah, 5 a.m. It's awesome, spiritual. I got a professional there. It's cool. And people did. 5 o'clock in the morning. Pretty soon this thing grew. We had 5, 6, 7, 8 guys at 5 o'clock in the morning to read and talk about the Bible. It was nuts. And God just did some amazing things with my crew over that year and a half. By the time I left, people related to each other differently. I mean, it wasn't complete. It wasn't necessarily heaven, but it looked a whole lot more like heaven than it did before. So much less brutality, a lot more respect. And I just felt like God was using me to bring a little bit of heaven to this environment. But it's not like it was good stuff all the time. There were lots and lots of times where I totally blew it. After I'd been there about 4 months or so, we got a new guy on our crew, and his name was Tony, and he was a really nice guy. Of all the negativity and crud that was going on in there, none of that came out of him. But he was kind of high-strung and a little guy and real easy to wind up, and if people got on him, he'd snap. And so guess what? He became the whipping boy of the crew, like within a couple of days. He was the butt of almost every joke all the time. And these were not like cute little jokes, like it wasn't like, hey, we tease you, man, because we love you. This was these guys unloading on him all of their pent-up frustration. And it was brutal, and he was hurt by it, and you could see it in his face. And so one day the guys were there, and they're teasing him. And they took his hard hat, and they hid it from him. And so our boss calls on the radio from another place in the refinery and tells Tony that he needs to come out to the job site. But of course, he can't go out into the refinery without his hard hat. If he did that, he would be fired immediately. So he's desperate, trying to find his hard hat. He's looking all over. He's trying to find it. And pretty soon he realizes the reason he can't find it is because the guys hid it. So he's looking around at everybody, and they're all laughing. In the meantime, he can't get out to the boss where he's supposed to be, the boss who is going to ream him out for taking so long, the boss who also, by the way, is incredibly mean to him. And the longer this is taking, the worse it's going to be, and he is spinning out. And everybody's laughing at him. And the more wound up he gets, the more they laugh. And now I'm there, and I know where his hat is, because I saw what they did. And everybody's looking at me like, don't say anything. So you know what I did? Nothing. I did nothing. Now I could see that this was like pushing him to his limit. Like it just about broke him. But I don't want to be the dorky Christian guy, right? So I just sat there paralyzed and I did nothing. And after about 15 minutes of this, he finally found it. They had put it on a chain and hoisted it up like 20 feet up. And it was up high, and they were all laughing because he couldn't find it, and he never realized he just needed to look up. So he finally finds it. They lower it down for him. He gets it. And on the way out the door, he said something that just about killed me. He looked at me, and he said, I can't believe you didn't help me. I can't believe that you knew that. I can't believe that you were a part of that. I can't believe that you did nothing. And I could just feel the hurt in his voice and in his eyes. And it was right at the end of the day, and I got into my car at the end of the day. And I was wrecked. I was like, what am I doing? God has me here to stop stuff like that, to bring his kingdom. And I had an opportunity, and I totally blew it. I cared way more about myself and about my comfort and fitting in, and I heaped more crud on this helpless guy. And that night, I just went home, and God did some work. I mean, it was upsetting, and I was having a hard time sleeping, all of it. So I just prayed, like, God, help me do better. Help me find a way to make things better for Tony. And over the next several months, God helped me with that. He did. And by the time I left that job, Tony was in a different place socially with all of those people. And for the most part, he was treated with respect. He went on, he became a foreman and then like a manager and did really well there. And I know that that wasn't all me. That was him and his heart and the goodness that was in him. But God used me to do some stuff to help with that. The reason I bring this up is that I think a lot of you guys are like me. You're really not all that prone to attack, and you're really not all that prone to isolate, but man, the compromise thing. You feel yourself tempted to compromise every day. And in the name of getting along or in the name of building bridges, you're trading your ability to impact people. And maybe these days you're finding yourself pretty consistently in a culture somewhere in your world that's off. It's off. And you're wrestling with the tension of what to do about it. And I just want to say, here's what I know. If you do nothing, it won't change. If you act like everybody else, nothing is going to change. But here's what else I know. If you ask God to help you with it, He will. He will. If you ask Him to give you wisdom, He will do that, to know what to do. He will. If you ask Him to give you strength, the courage to be able to take action that you know you need to take, He will. If you ask Him to use you to make a difference, He will. But if you just resign yourself to acting like everybody else, if you do nothing, if you're too afraid to be different, nothing is going to change. And the world in that place will just go on like it has. It always has. Guys, Jesus was no Mr. Rogers. Jesus was a game changer. Jesus swam against the grain. And if you and I follow Him, eventually He's going to ask us to do the same.